Aliens boarded the human flagship. They found a captain who refused to die. The stars did not care about war. They burned the same cold light whether ships were flying peacefully between them or tearing each other apart with plasma fire. On this day, in a quiet corner of space near the edge of human territory, the stars watched a battle that would change everything. The UNS Vigilant, the flagship of the Third Human Fleet, drifted through space, with smoke pouring from 3 of its 4 engines. Sparks flew from broken control panels. Red emergency lights flashed through every hallway, painting the walls in a color that looked like blood. The ship groaned like a wounded animal, its metal bones bending from the damage of the last 2 hours of fighting. Outside, the battle was already lost. 12 human warships had entered this system to defend a small mining colony from the Skarn Dominion, an alien empire that had been pushing into human space for the last 3 years. The Skarn were not like humans. They were tall, with hard gray skin like stone, 4 arms, and eyes that glowed faintly orange in the dark. They believed in strength above all else. To them, weakness was a disease, and mercy was a joke told by cowards. The Skarn fleet had come with 30 ships, 30 against 12. The humans had known the numbers were bad, but they had come anyway, because the mining colony held 12,000 civilians who could not defend themselves. Now, after 2 hours of brutal fighting, 9 of the 12 human ships were gone. Some had been destroyed outright, turned into balls of fire and then into nothing. Others had been forced to retreat, their crews weeping as they left their comrades behind, because a retreat that saved some lives was better than a stand that saved none. Only the Vigilant remained in the fight, along with 2 smaller escort ships that were already sinking into the dark, their power gone, their crews scrambling into escape pods. On the bridge of the Vigilant, Captain Marcus Kane held onto the edge of his command chair with one hand, because the artificial gravity kept flickering, and every flicker sent his stomach lurching. He was a man of 52 years, with gray hair cut short, and a face that had seen too many battles. A long scar ran down the left side of his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight decades ago, when he had been a young lieutenant on his first deployment. His uniform was torn at the shoulder, and blood, his own blood, had soaked through the fabric there. A piece of shrapnel had caught him during the last enemy volley. He had not let the medic near him yet. There was no time. "Report," Kane said. His voice was steady, though his body was screaming at him to sit down and rest. "Shields at 12%, sir," said Lieutenant Amara Osei, the tactical officer, her fingers flying over a control panel that sparked every few seconds. "We can't take another direct hit. Weapons? 2 of 6 turrets still firing. The rest are offline or destroyed. Engines? 1 working engine, sir. We can move, but slowly. No jump capability. The jump drive took damage 20 minutes ago." Kane closed his eyes for 1 second, just 1 second, to let the weight of it settle on him, and then he opened them again, because a captain did not have the luxury of despair. Despair was a gift he could not afford to give his crew. "Colony transports?" he asked. "All away, sir," answered Ensign Tomas Reyes from the communication station, relief clear in his young voice. "Last transport confirmed jump 12 minutes ago. All 12,000 civilians are safe." That was something. That was, in fact, everything. The mission had been to protect those people, and the mission had succeeded, even if the cost was going to be terrible. Kane allowed himself a small breath of relief before turning his mind back to the battle in front of him. "Then our job now is to make sure this ship doesn't fall into enemy hands, and to bring as many of our people home as we can," Kane said. "Osei, keep those turrets firing. Reyes, get me a channel to Fleet Command. I want them to know the colony is saved, and I want them to know what's happening here." "Aye, sir." On the main view screen, the battle continued to rage. A Skarn cruiser, long and jagged like a shark made of iron, moved closer to the Vigilant. Its hull was covered in short spikes, a design choice the Skarn made not for any real military purpose, but because it looked frightening, and the Skarn cared deeply about looking frightening. The cruiser's guns lit up, and streaks of orange plasma crossed the black of space toward the Vigilant. "Brace," Osei shouted. The ship shook violently. Metal screamed somewhere below decks. A control panel on the far side of the bridge exploded in a shower of sparks, and a young crewman named Petty Officer Diaz threw himself backward, narrowly avoiding the blast. Smoke filled the air, thick and acrid, and the ship's automatic systems began pumping in fresh oxygen to clear it. "Shields at 4%, Osei said, her voice tight but controlled. "One more hit like that and they're gone." Kane gripped the arm of his chair. The pain in his shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, but he pushed it down, buried it somewhere he could deal with it later, if there was a later. "Helm! Hard turn. Put our remaining shield strength between us and that cruiser," Kane ordered. "Aye, sir," said the helmsman, a steady young woman named Chen, and the Vigilant groaned as it turned, using its last working engine to twist its body in space, like a wounded soldier trying to protect an injured arm. It worked, for a moment. The next volley of plasma fire struck the shields instead of the hull, and though the shields failed completely under the impact, the hull itself remained intact. But the reprieve was brief. Osei's console lit up with a new alert, and her face went pale. "Sir, I'm reading multiple small craft launching from the Skarn cruiser. Boarding pods. They're coming right at us." Kane's stomach tightened. Boarding pods meant the Skarn were done trying to destroy the Vigilant from range. They wanted to take it. They wanted to walk through its halls and either capture its crew or, more likely, given everything humanity knew about Skarn customs, kill everyone aboard and claim the ship as a trophy. The Skarn did not take many prisoners. They believed prisoners were proof of weakness, both in the captor for keeping them and in the captured for allowing themselves to be caught. "How many pods?" Kane asked. "6, sir. Estimated 40 to 60 Skarn warriors total." Kane did the math in his head. The Vigilance crew, after casualties, numbered around 140, but most of those were engineers, medics, and support staff, not trained combat soldiers. The ship carried a security detachment of only 20 Marines, and they had already suffered losses during an earlier hull breach. "All hands, this is the captain," Kane said, his voice carrying through the ship's intercom system, calm and clear despite everything. "The enemy is attempting to board us. All non-essential personnel, retreat to the escape pods on Deck 7, and prepare for immediate evacuation. Security personnel, converge on the bridge and engineering. This is not a drill. Move." He turned to Osei. "Send the evacuation order through every channel. I want as many of our people off this ship as possible, before those pods reach the hull." "Sir, what about you?" Osei asked, though she already seemed to know the answer. Kane looked at her, and for a moment, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Someone has to make sure the Skarn don't get anything useful off this ship. Command codes, fleet positions, our tech. I'm staying until the ship is scuttled or the crew is clear, whichever comes first." "Then I'm staying too," Osei said immediately. "Osei, with respect, sir, you'll need someone on tactical if this turns into a fight inside our own ship. And someone needs to keep an eye on the self-destruct sequence in case you're—" She hesitated. "In case you're unable to trigger it yourself." Kane studied her for a long moment. He could have ordered her off the ship. He was the captain, and his word was law aboard the Vigilant. But he had learned, over 30 years of service, that some orders were not worth giving, because the people receiving them would not obey, not truly, not in their hearts, and a captain who gave orders that would not be followed only weakened his own authority. Better to let good soldiers make their own choices, when those choices came from courage rather than foolishness. "Fine," Kane said. "Reyes, you too, if you want. I need someone keeping Fleet Command updated." "I'm staying, sir," Reyes said without hesitation, though his young face was pale with fear he was fighting hard to control. Around the bridge, most of the crew began filing out, heading for the escape pods, some of them throwing final glances back at their captain, their eyes full of things they didn't have time to say. A few, like Osei and Reyes, chose to remain. Diaz, the young petty officer who had dodged the exploding console, also stayed, picking up a rifle from the bridge's small weapons locker and checking its charge. "Sir, I'm not much of a fighter, but I'm a decent shot," Diaz said. "I'd rather be useful here than sit in a pod hoping the Skarn don't blow it up for fun." Kane nodded. He understood that feeling well. There was a kind of peace that came from choosing your fight rather than waiting for it to find you. The medic finally caught up to Kane during the chaos, a stern older woman named Dr. Priya Nair, who took one look at his shoulder and scowled. "Captain, that shrapnel needs to come out now, or you're going to lose that arm, and possibly a lot more blood than you can spare." "Make it quick, Doctor," Kane said, sitting still as she worked, gritting his teeth against the pain as she pulled the jagged piece of metal free and pressed a sealant patch over the wound. It would not heal him, not really, but it would stop the bleeding long enough for him to keep functioning. That's a battlefield patch, not a cure, Nair warned. You need real medical attention, and soon. Understood, Kane said, though both of them knew there was little chance of that happening anytime soon. Below decks, the Skarn boarding pods struck the hull of the Vigilant, like fists hitting a drum. The sound echoed through the corridors, a deep metallic boom that made everyone still aboard flinch. Then came the sound of cutting torches, of metal being sliced and peeled back, and finally, the terrible hiss of atmosphere escaping before emergency bulkheads sealed the breaches automatically. The Skarn began pouring into the ship. They moved fast, their 4 arms letting them climb through wreckage and squeeze through gaps that would have stopped a human. Their gray skin seemed to absorb the dim emergency lighting, making them look like moving shadows in the smoke-filled corridors. They carried heavy plasma rifles in their lower arms, and wicked curved blades in their upper arms, blades they were eager to use, because for many young Skarn warriors, close combat was considered more honorable than shooting from a distance. The first clash happened near Deck 5, where a group of retreating engineers ran straight into a Skarn boarding party. The Marines assigned to escort them opened fire immediately, and for a few brutal seconds, the corridor lit up with crossing lines of plasma fire. 2 Skarn fell. 3 Marines fell. The engineers scattered, some making it to the escape pods, others not so lucky. Word of the fighting spread through the ship's intercom system in short, panicked bursts. Kane listened to it all from the bridge, his jaw tight, his hand pressed against his freshly bandaged shoulder. Each report of a fallen crew member felt like another piece of shrapnel finding its way into him. "Sir," Osei said quietly, "escape pod count. We've gotten 61 people off the ship so far." "Keep counting," Kane said. "Everyone matters." Aboard the lead boarding pod, a Skarn commander named Vrek Thozar watched the chaos on the Vigilant through a small display embedded in his armored suit. Vrek was a war leader of considerable reputation among the Skarn Dominion, a veteran of a dozen campaigns against a dozen different species, and he had grown used to a certain pattern in these boarding actions. Cripple the enemy ship, board it, watch the crew break, either fighting with obvious desperation and poor discipline, or surrendering outright once their command structure collapsed. Humans, in his experience over the last 3 years of this war, tended toward the former more than the latter, which he respected slightly, but their resistance always ended the same way, in Skarn victory, and in the deaths of most everyone aboard who did not flee in time. He expected nothing different today. The Vigilant was already crippled, its crew was already fleeing. All that remained was to reach the bridge, kill whatever was left of the command staff, and claim the wreck as another trophy in the long war, to break humanity's will to resist Skarn expansion. "Report," Vrek growled into his suit's comm system, his voice a deep rumble that carried authority, earned through decades of violence. "Boarding parties 2 and 4, report resistance on decks 5 and 7, came the reply from one of his lieutenants. "Casualties acceptable. We are advancing toward the bridge." "Good," Vrek said. "Take the bridge. Take their captain alive if you can. I want to see the face of the human who thought he could stand against us." He did not know yet what kind of captain awaited him. He did not know that Marcus Kane had already decided he would rather die than let his ship, his crew's sacrifice, or his country's secrets fall into Skarn hands. He did not know that the human concept of refusing to die was about to become something far more literal and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. On the bridge, Kane rose slowly from his command chair, wincing as pain shot through his wounded shoulder. He walked to the weapons locker and pulled out a sidearm, checking its charge with the practiced motion of a man who had done this many times before, though not often in recent years. He was a starship captain, not a soldier, but every officer in the fleet trained in combat basics, and 30 years ago, before he ever wore captain's stripes, Kane had served 2 tours as a ground infantry officer during the border conflicts. Old training did not fade completely, even when buried under decades of desk work and command decisions. "Osei, how long until those boarding parties reach us?" Kane asked. Osei checked her console, her face tight with concentration. Based on their movement pattern, maybe 15 minutes, sir. They're fighting through resistance on 5 and 7, but they're not slowing down much. Then we have 15 minutes to get as many people into those escape pods as we can, Kane said, and to prepare a welcome for whoever makes it up here. He looked around the bridge at the small group that remained. Osei at tactical, Reyes at communications, Diaz with his rifle, Dr. Nair with her medical kit, and a handful of other crew members who had chosen to stay rather than flee. They were tired. They were scared. Some of them were injured, but not one of them looked ready to give up. Kane felt something stir in his chest, something that pain and exhaustion could not quite smother. It was not hope, exactly. Hope felt too fragile a word for what he felt. It was something closer to determination, the stubborn, unbreakable kind that had carried humanity through every dark chapter of its long and difficult history. The Skarn believed strength meant conquering others. Kane believed strength meant refusing to be conquered, no matter the cost, no matter the odds. "Everyone, listen to me," Kane said, and his voice, though quiet, carried a weight that made every person on the bridge turn to face him. "I'm not going to pretend this looks good. It doesn't. We're outnumbered. Our ship is falling apart, and the enemy is coming for us. But I want every one of you to understand something. As long as one of us is still breathing and still fighting, this ship has not fallen. Do you understand me? A ship isn't just metal and wires. It's the people who refuse to let it go. And I don't intend to let this one go. Not today." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Diaz, still gripping his rifle, gave a short, firm nod. "Not today, sir." One by one, the others echoed him, their voices quiet but steady. "Not today." Down in the smoke-filled corridors of the Vigilant, the sounds of battle grew closer. The heavy footsteps of Skarn warriors, the hiss of plasma weapons, the shouts of dying men and women, mixing with the mechanical groans of a ship that refused, somehow, to fall completely silent. Captain Marcus Kane checked his sidearm one final time, felt the throbbing pain in his wounded shoulder, and turned to face the door of the bridge. Whatever came through it next would find him standing. The corridors of the UNS Vigilant had become a maze of smoke, sparks, and shadows. Emergency lights flickered red along the walls, throwing strange shapes across twisted metal and shattered panels. Somewhere below, fires still burned in sealed sections, kept from spreading only by the ship's automatic containment systems that groaned with every passing minute as they struggled to hold a dying vessel together. Vrek Thozar moved through this wreckage with the calm confidence of a predator who had never once doubted his own superiority. He walked upright despite the low ceilings that forced his warriors to duck, his 4 arms held ready, 2 gripping heavy plasma rifles and 2 gripping curved blades stained with human blood from the fighting on Deck 5. Behind him marched a dozen Skarn warriors, the survivors of the boarding party that had cut through 2 decks of human resistance to reach this point, just outside the final corridor leading to the Vigilance Bridge. "Movement sensors show minimal resistance ahead," reported Skarn Lieutenant Grath, checking a device strapped to his forearm. "Perhaps 5-6 humans remaining near the bridge entrance. The rest have fled to escape pods." Vrek made a low sound in his throat, something between a grunt and a laugh. "Fled, as expected. This human captain will surrender or die within minutes. Advance." He had said the same words, or nearly the same words, in a dozen other campaigns against a dozen other species. He had watched proud warriors of the Threll Collective break and beg for mercy. He had watched the insectoid Vashtar hive minds simply stop functioning once their queen was threatened. Every species had its breaking point, a moment where the cost of resistance became too high, and something inside them simply gave way. Vrek expected nothing different from humanity, a species the Skarn considered soft, sentimental, and far too attached to concepts like mercy and cooperation to ever match true Skarn strength. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The Skarn boarding party rounded the final corner and found the corridor leading to the bridge blocked by a makeshift barricade, overturned equipment lockers, and bent metal panels stacked hastily but effectively across the width of the hall. Behind it, 5 human figures crouched with weapons raised, and at the center of them stood a gray-haired man in a torn, blood-stained uniform, his sidearm gripped steady in one hand, despite the dark stains spreading across his shoulder. Captain Marcus Kane looked directly at Vrek through the smoke, and something in his gaze made even the veteran Skarn commander pause for half a second. There was no fear there. There was pain, certainly, and exhaustion, but no fear. And Vrek had seen fear in the eyes of 100 different species. This was something else. "This is your only warning," Kane called out, his voice carrying clearly down the corridor, translated automatically through the small device clipped to his collar. "Turn back now, and some of you might live to tell your commanders that humans don't go down easy. Stay, and you'll find out the hard way." Vrek actually laughed, a harsh, grinding sound. A wounded human, hiding behind furniture, threatens a Skarn war party. "This is the great resistance we were warned about?" "Wasn't a threat," Kane said. "Was a courtesy. Won't be offering another one." Vrek raised one of his plasma rifles. "Kill them. Take the bridge." What followed was chaos. The Skarn warriors surged forward, firing as they came, and the corridor erupted in crossing lines of orange plasma fire and the sharp cracks of human energy weapons. Kane dropped low behind the barricade, as a bolt of plasma seared through the air above his head, close enough that he felt the heat of it against his scalp. Beside him, Diaz fired in short, controlled bursts, dropping one Skarn warrior, with a shot to the neck where the armor was thinnest, then ducking back down, as return fire chewed through the barricade's outer layer. "They're pushing hard," Osei shouted over the noise, firing her own weapon around the edge of a fallen locker. "Hold the line," Kane shouted back, his voice hoarse but strong. He leaned around the barricade just long enough to fire 2 shots, one of which struck a Skarn warrior square in the chest, staggering him before a second shot from Diaz finished the job. The fight was brutal and close, the kind of combat that left no room for elegant tactics, only raw determination, and the will to keep pulling a trigger, even as your own body screamed for you to stop. Reyes, never trained for this kind of combat, huddled behind the barricade working frantically at a portable console, trying to keep an open channel to Fleet Command, even as the battle raged around him. Dr. Nair, though a healer by trade and training, had picked up a fallen rifle from one of the Marines who died earlier on Deck 5, and she fired it now with grim determination, her hands steady despite everything her profession had taught her about the sanctity of life. A Skarn warrior made it over the barricade, blade raised, and Kane threw himself sideways, ignoring the fresh burst of agony from his wounded shoulder, firing 3 shots into the creature's torso before it could bring the weapon down. He rolled back to his feet, breathing hard, blood now soaking through the shoulder bandage completely, but his eyes remained fixed on the fight in front of him, calculating, watching for the next threat. Vrek, watching from the rear of his formation, felt the first stirrings of something unfamiliar. Irritation, certainly, at the unexpected losses his warriors were taking, but beneath that, something closer to curiosity. This human captain, wounded and outnumbered, fighting from behind a barricade with a rifle in one hand while his shoulder bled freely, showed no sign of breaking. If anything, he seemed to grow more focused, more dangerous, with every passing minute of the fight. "Fall back and regroup," Vrek ordered his remaining warriors, pulling them out of direct engagement range. 8 Skarn warriors had entered this corridor. Only 5 remained standing, and 2 of those carried wounds of their own. On the human side of the barricade, the cost had also been heavy. One of the crew members who had stayed behind, a young engineer named Petty Officer Kowalski, lay dead near the barricade's edge, struck by plasma fire during the initial exchange. Kane felt the loss like a physical blow, but there was no time to mourn, not yet, not with the enemy still active in the corridor beyond. "Status," Kane said, his voice tight. "We lost Kowalski," Osei reported, her own voice thick with barely controlled emotion. "Everyone else is still up, but Diaz took a graze on his leg." "I'm fine," Diaz said through gritted teeth, pressing a hand against a shallow burn on his thigh. "Still standing." Kane nodded grimly. "Reyes, status on that channel to Fleet Command?" "I've got a weak connection, sir, but it's holding," Reyes said. "I've been transmitting our situation in bursts. Command knows we're under boarding attack. Sir, they're saying the nearest reinforcement fleet is 4 hours out." 4 hours. Kane did the math in his head, and the number was not encouraging. The Vigilance life support, damaged as it was, might hold that long. The remaining crew, fighting a desperate defense against a determined enemy, might not. "Keep that channel open," Kane said. "Every minute we survive is a minute closer to help." Down the corridor, Vrek considered his options. He could continue throwing warriors at the barricade, wearing down the human defenders through sheer attrition, though at a cost he was beginning to find genuinely surprising for what he had assumed would be an easy conquest. Or he could try something more clever. Grath, Vrek said to his lieutenant, take 3 warriors and find another route to the bridge. Ship schematics show maintenance corridors branching off from Deck 6. Circle around and hit them from behind, while we hold their attention here. Understood, Commander, Grath said, and slipped away into the smoke with 3 warriors following him. Vrek then turned his attention back toward the barricade and called out, his translated voice carrying down the corridor with a note of something almost like respect, though respect was not a concept the Skarn extended easily to species they considered lesser. You, Vrek called toward Kane. Human captain, you fight with more skill than I expected. Perhaps there is honor to be found in this after all. Surrender now, and I will see that you die a clean death, weapon in hand, rather than the slow death that awaits if you continue this pointless resistance. Kane, still crouched behind the barricade with his sidearm ready, called back without hesitation. Appreciate the offer. Gonna have to decline. See? Where I come from, we don't measure a fight by how it looks like it's going to end. We measure it by how hard you make the other guy work. And I intend to make you work real hard. Vrek's orange eyes narrowed. There was something in the human's tone, something almost like humor mixed with the defiance, that Vrek found deeply unsettling. In his experience, defiance in the face of certain defeat came from either desperation or delusion. This did not sound like either. It sounded like a simple, calm statement of fact, as if the human captain genuinely believed his continued resistance mattered, regardless of the odds against him. What Vrek did not yet understand, and what he would come to understand only through painful experience over the following hours, was that this belief was not delusion. It was something the Skarn had never truly encountered before in 3 years of war against humanity. The simple, stubborn refusal to accept that a fight was already lost, combined with just enough skill and cleverness to occasionally make that refusal matter. Behind the barricade, Kane took a moment to check on his crew, moving carefully to avoid straining his wounded shoulder further, though the movement still sent sharp pain radiating down his arm. Dr. Nair caught his attention and gestured for him to sit for a moment. Captain, that wound is getting worse, she said, examining the now heavily soaked bandage. You've lost a significant amount of blood. I need to do a proper repair, or you're going to lose consciousness at the worst possible moment. Make it fast, Kane said, gritting his teeth as she worked, cleaning and resealing the wound as best she could, with the limited medical supplies she had grabbed before the fighting began. This isn't sustainable, sir, Nair said quietly, her professional concern evident despite the chaos around them. You need actual surgery, real medical facilities, not field patches. Then I guess I need to survive long enough to get to one, Kane replied, forcing a tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Thank you, doctor. Now get back to your position. As Nair moved away, Osei approached Kane, keeping her voice low. Sir, I'm reading movement on Deck 6, small group, moving fast, heading toward a maintenance access point that connects to a corridor near the bridge's rear entrance. Kane's eyes narrowed. They're trying to flank us. Looks that way, sir. Kane thought quickly, running through the ship's layout in his mind. Years of familiarity with the Vigilance design, giving him an advantage the young Skarn commander could never fully replicate, no matter how good his schematics were. He knew this ship. He had walked its corridors for 3 years as its captain. He knew its weaknesses, its shortcuts, its hidden vulnerabilities, better than anyone alive. Diaz, can you still move on that leg? I can move, sir. Take 2 of the Marines still guarding the escape pod route. Head to the maintenance corridor on Deck 6, Section 12. There's a manual bulkhead override there. If you seal it before the Skarn flanking party reaches it, you'll buy us time, and maybe trap a few of them in a section we can vent to space if things get desperate enough. On it, sir, Diaz said, wincing as he moved, but already heading toward the task with grim determination. Kane turned back toward the barricade, watching the smoke-filled corridor beyond for any sign of renewed attack. Vrek's forces had pulled back, regrouping, and Kane suspected correctly that this was not a retreat, but a pause before a new strategy took shape. Osei, how are the escape pods looking? How many more people do we have left to get off this ship? Osei checked her console, her face tightening with concern. We're down to the last few groups, sir. Engineering reports about 15 crew still working to keep life support stable before they evacuate. Medbay has another 10 wounded being moved to pods now. Get them moving faster, Kane said. I don't like how confident that Skarn commander sounded. As if summoned by Kane's words, new sounds began echoing from deeper within the ship. The sound of cutting torches against metal. The sound of Skarn voices calling to each other in their harsh, guttural language. And beneath it all, the increasingly worrying groan of the Vigilant structural frame, stressed beyond its limits by battle damage, and now further strained by the additional cutting and forced entry happening in multiple sections simultaneously. Reyes, still hunched over his communications console, looked up with sudden alarm. Captain, I'm picking up something new. Another set of transmissions, Skarn in origin, but not from the boarding party. It sounds like, sir, I think it's another ship. A second Skarn vessel is moving into position near the Vigilant. Kane felt his stomach tighten. Reinforcements. Looks that way, sir. If they send another boarding party... Kane didn't need Reyes to finish the sentence. The situation, already desperate, was about to become significantly worse. He looked around at his remaining crew, at Osei, still watching her tactical readouts with fierce concentration, at Reyes, trying to maintain a fragile lifeline, to a fleet that was still hours away, at Dr. Nair, checking supplies for wounds not yet suffered, and he felt the full weight of command settle onto his shoulders, alongside the physical pain of his injury. He thought, briefly, of his wife back on Earth, of the letter he had written to her months ago in case something like this ever happened, tucked away in his personal effects with instructions to be delivered only if he did not return. He thought of the 12,000 civilians from the mining colony, safely away now because of the sacrifice this crew had made and continued to make. He thought of every officer and enlisted soldier who had served under him over 30 years of service, and the lessons he had learned from each of them about what it truly meant to lead. And then he pushed all of it aside, because there was no room for memory or grief in the middle of a fight, only room for the next decision, the next order, the next breath that kept him standing between the enemy and everything he had sworn to protect. New plan, Kane said, his voice cutting through the tension on the bridge with renewed determination. We're not just holding this position anymore. We're going to make this ship the most expensive prize the Skarn have ever tried to claim. Osei, pull up the ship schematics. I want every trap, every choke point, every advantage this old girl can give us. If they want the Vigilant, they're going to have to earn every single meter of it. Osei allowed herself a small, fierce smile despite the exhaustion and fear etched into her features. Yes, sir. Down the corridor, hidden in the smoke and shadow, Vrek Thozar prepared his forces for a renewed assault, unaware that the human captain he had begun to grudgingly respect was about to make this battle far more costly than any Skarn commander had anticipated. The reinforcement vessel drawing closer to the Vigilant carried fresh warriors, eager for glory and unaware that the ship they were about to board held a defender who had already decided, in the deepest part of himself, that he would rather turn every corridor into a grave than let the Skarn claim an easy victory. The battle for the UNS Vigilant was far from over. In many ways, it had only just begun. Diaz moved through the maintenance corridor on Deck 6 with his rifle held ready, his burned leg sending sharp warnings up through his body with every step. But he ignored the pain, the way soldiers had learned to ignore pain since the very first wars humanity had ever fought. Behind him came two Marines, the last uninjured members of the Vigilance Security Detachment, both of them young, both of them scared, and both of them determined not to show it. Section 12, up ahead, Diaz said, pointing toward a heavy bulkhead door set into the corridor wall, its surface marked with faded warning labels about atmospheric hazards beyond. Manual override is right there. We seal this, we cut off their flanking route. The three of them moved quickly toward the control panel, and Diaz had just reached out to activate the manual override when the sound of cutting torches echoed from the other side of the bulkhead, closer than expected. Grath and his three Skarn warriors were already there, already working to force their way through from the other direction. They beat us to it, one of the Marines said, her voice tight with tension. Then we hold here, and make sure they don't get through, Diaz said, already moving to position himself and his companions behind whatever cover the narrow corridor offered. Take positions. If that door opens, we open fire immediately. No hesitation. They waited in tense silence, the only sound the distant screech of the cutting torch against metal. growing louder, closer, more insistent. Diaz's mind wandered, despite his training telling him to stay focused, to the reason he had joined the fleet in the first place. He had grown up on a farming colony on the edge of human space, a place that had been peaceful his entire childhood, until the Skarn Dominion's expansion had brought war within a few systems of his home. He had watched news reports of other colonies, smaller and less defended than his own, simply vanishing from communication, their populations either killed or, in the more optimistic reports that nobody quite believed, enslaved. He had enlisted the day he turned 18, not out of some grand sense of glory, but out of a simple, practical fear that if he did not fight, no one else would fight for people like him. The bulkhead door groaned, then began to glow orange along a cut line, where the Skarn torch had weakened the metal. Diaz raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel toward the point where the breach would open. "Steady," he whispered to the two Marines beside him. "Steady." The door burst inward with a shower of sparks and molten metal, and immediately, Diaz and the Marines opened fire into the smoke and confusion beyond. A Skarn warrior stumbled through the breach and fell almost immediately under the combined fire of 3 human rifles. But the others were ready too, and plasma bolts came screaming back through the opening, forcing Diaz and his companions to duck behind whatever cover the corridor offered. The fight that followed was short, brutal, and close, fought in a narrow corridor where there was no room to maneuver, only room to trade fire and hope your aim was better than the enemy's. One of the Marines took a hit to the arm and cried out, but kept firing with her uninjured hand. Diaz felt a plasma bolt sear past, close enough to singe the fabric of his uniform, and he returned fire with grim determination, dropping a second Skarn warrior with a well-placed shot. Grath, seeing 2 of his warriors fall in quick succession, made a tactical decision that surprised the humans. Rather than continuing to push forward into a fight that was proving costlier than expected, he ordered a retreat, pulling his remaining warrior back through the breach and away into the ship's damaged sections, choosing to seek another route, rather than continue bleeding warriors against this unexpectedly stubborn resistance. "They're pulling back," the uninjured Marine said, disbelief clear in her voice. "Don't celebrate yet," Diaz said, breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing through his system. "Get that bulkhead sealed before they try again, and get your friend to Dr. Nair. That arm needs looking at." As the Marines worked to manually seal the damaged bulkhead, Diaz allowed himself a brief moment to catch his breath, leaning against the corridor wall and looking down at his own burned leg, which had started bleeding again from the exertion of the fight. He thought about Captain Kane, still holding the barricade near the bridge, wounded far worse than Diaz himself, and yet somehow still standing, still fighting, still giving orders with the same calm authority he had shown since this nightmare began. Diaz did not know much about Kane's personal history. Few of the crew did. Kane was not a man who talked about himself, preferring instead to focus entirely on the mission and the people under his command. But there were rumors, the kind that traveled through a ship's crew like whispered legends, about a young lieutenant who had survived the Battle of Kestrel Station during the border conflicts 3 decades ago, one of only a handful of survivors from a garrison of 200, having held a critical position against overwhelming odds for nearly 18 hours until reinforcements finally arrived. Some said that experience had shaped everything about who Kane became afterward: the calm under pressure, the refusal to accept defeat as inevitable, the fierce protective instinct toward every soul under his command. Whatever the truth of those old rumors, Diaz found himself believing them more with every passing minute of this battle. A man did not fight the way Kane was fighting, wounded and outnumbered, without some deep well of experience and conviction to draw from. Back near the bridge, Kane had used the brief lull in fighting to reorganize his defenses, drawing on his encyclopedic knowledge of the Vigilance layout to set new traps and choke points throughout the corridors leading to the bridge. Osei worked alongside him, pulling up ship schematics and marking potential ambush points, her tactical mind working in perfect harmony with Kane's strategic experience. "If they come through here," Kane said, pointing at a junction on the schematic display, "we can vent the atmosphere in this section remotely, once our people are clear. It won't kill armored Skarn outright, but it'll disorient them, maybe knock a few off their feet in the sudden pressure change. I can rig the vent controls to trigger from here," Osei said, already working at a nearby console. "Just say the word, sir." "Good. What about here?" Kane pointed to another section. This corridor has exposed power conduits from the battle damage. If we can redirect a power surge through them at the right moment, that could work, but it's risky. Might damage our own systems further. Our systems are already half destroyed, Kane said grimly. I'll take the risk, if it means taking a few more Skarn out of this fight before they reach us. As they worked, Reyes called out from his communications station, his voice carrying a note of urgency. Captain, I've got Fleet Command on a stable channel now. They want to speak with you directly. Kane moved to the communications console, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. The screen flickered to life, showing the face of Admiral Sarah Whitfield, commander of the Third Fleet, her expression grim, as she looked at whatever damage reports had already reached her about the Vigilance condition. Captain Kane, Whitfield said, status report. Ship is heavily damaged, Admiral, but we're still fighting. We've evacuated the majority of non-combat personnel. Boarding parties have engaged us on multiple decks. We've repelled 2 assaults so far, but I'm reading a second Skarn vessel moving into position, likely bringing reinforcements. Whitfield's jaw tightened. Reinforcement fleet is still 3.5 hours out, Captain. I won't lie to you, that ship might not hold that long. Understood, Admiral. We'll hold as long as we can. Kane, Whitfield said, her voice softening slightly. You've already accomplished the mission. The colony is safe. No one would blame you for ordering a full evacuation and self-destruct sequence, rather than continuing this fight. Kane was quiet for a moment, considering her words. It would have been the easier choice, certainly. Trigger the ship's self-destruct, evacuate everyone remaining, deny the Skarn their prize entirely, and end this battle on his own terms, rather than continuing to bleed his crew in a desperate defense. Any reasonable officer would have understood that decision. But Kane had never been the type of man to take the easier path when a harder one might accomplish more. Admiral, if I trigger self-destruct now, we lose the Vigilant entirely, along with any chance of denying the Skarn valuable intelligence about our fleet movements and technology that they might otherwise learn incidentally, simply by observing how we fight. Every minute we hold this ship and keep fighting is a minute we're studying their tactics, their equipment, their weaknesses. And every Skarn warrior we take down here is one less warrior facing our people in the next battle. I intend to make this fight cost them as much as possible before this is over, one way or another. Whitfield studied him for a long moment through the screen, and something like respect, mixed with deep concern, showed clearly in her expression. That's your call to make, Captain, but don't throw away lives for pride. If it comes down to it, get your remaining people out and finish it clean. That's an order, not a suggestion. Understood, Admiral, Kane said. Kane out. The screen went dark, and Kane turned back to Osei, who had clearly heard the entire exchange. You heard the Admiral, Kane said, but I intend to hold this ship as long as humanly possible, before I consider that option. Understood, sir, Osei said, though her tone carried a note of worry she couldn't quite hide. The lull in fighting did not last long. Within 20 minutes, new movement appeared on Osei's sensors, a fresh wave of Skarn warriors advancing from multiple directions simultaneously, clearly coordinated by Vrek, in an attempt to overwhelm the human defenders through sheer numbers and multiple angles of attack at once. Sir, they're coming from 3 directions now, Osei reported, her voice tight. Main corridor, the maintenance access on Deck 6, and what looks like a new breach point near the auxiliary control room. They're not holding back anymore, Kane said grimly. Vrek knows we're bleeding him dry with every assault. He's trying to end this fast before his reinforcements even arrive, probably to save face as much as anything else. Kane moved quickly, despite the pain radiating through his shoulder and the exhaustion that had begun creeping into every movement after hours of continuous combat and blood loss. Osei, trigger that atmospheric vent in the main corridor the moment they're fully inside the section. Reyes, get a warning to Diaz and his team about the maintenance corridor assault. Everyone else, we hold the bridge entrance no matter what. The next several minutes passed in a blur of chaos and violence. In the main corridor, Osei's timing proved perfect, venting the atmosphere in a section of the ship the moment a group of 6 Skarn warriors advanced through it, sending them stumbling and disoriented as the sudden pressure change threw their balance and vision into chaos, giving the human defenders crucial seconds to fire on them before they could properly return fire. 3 Skarn fell in that ambush alone, and the survivors retreated in confusion, unprepared for a tactic that exploited their own ship's damage against them. In the maintenance corridor, Diaz and his remaining Marine fought a desperate delaying action against Grath's renewed assault, forced back, step by step, but never quite broken, using every piece of cover and every trick they could improvise to slow the Skarn advance and buy precious time. And at the bridge entrance itself, Kane, Osei, Reyes, and Dr. Nair fought alongside the last of the remaining crew, who had chosen to stand rather than flee, holding the barricade against wave after wave of increasingly frustrated Skarn attackers, each assault costing the enemy more warriors than the last, even as the human defenders grew more exhausted and their own numbers dwindled. Through it all, Kane remained at the center of the defense, directing his people with calm authority, even as his own strength visibly began to fade, blood loss and exhaustion taking their toll on a body that had already been pushed far beyond reasonable limits. He fought not with the reckless abandon of a man who had given up hope, but with the focused determination of a man who understood exactly what was at stake and had simply decided, somewhere deep in himself, that giving up was not an option he was willing to consider, regardless of the cost to himself personally. Vrek, watching the mounting casualties among his own forces with growing frustration and something approaching genuine confusion, found himself questioning assumptions he had held about humanity since the war began 3 years earlier. He had been told, by intelligence reports and by his own commanders, that humans were a soft species, quick to break under sustained pressure, lacking the deep-rooted warrior culture that defined Skarn society and gave the Dominion its military strength. Yet here, aboard this crippled, dying ship, a wounded human captain and a handful of exhausted crew members were making his forces pay dearly for every meter of ground, refusing every offer of surrender, refusing every reasonable expectation of when a defeated force should simply give up and accept the inevitable. It did not match anything in his experience, and for the first time in many years of warfare across a dozen different campaigns, Vrek Thozar felt something he had not felt in a very long time, genuine uncertainty about how this battle would ultimately end. He called for his reinforcement vessel to accelerate its approach, no longer willing to rely solely on the boarding party he had already committed to this fight. Whatever kind of enemy he had found aboard the Vigilant, he intended to overwhelm it with numbers that even the most stubborn human resistance could not withstand. But even as more Skarn warriors prepared to join the assault, Captain Marcus Kane stood at the heart of his ship's defense, blood-soaked and exhausted but unbroken, and he made a quiet promise to himself that he intended to keep, no matter what came next. He would not fall easily, and he would not fall alone. If the Skarn wanted to take this ship, they would remember the price of it for the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives turned out to be. The second Skarn vessel, a heavy assault cruiser named the Dread Talon in the Skarn tongue, closed the distance to the UNS Vigilant with grim purpose. Aboard it, 40 fresh Skarn warriors prepared for boarding, eager to join what their commanders had described as a straightforward mopping-up operation against a crippled human ship. None of them yet understood the true cost that awaited them, because Vrek, unwilling to admit that his forces were struggling against what should have been an easy target, had reported the situation aboard the Vigilant in far more optimistic terms than reality actually warranted. On the Vigilant itself, the battle had entered a strange, exhausted rhythm. Assault, repel, brief pause, assault again. Captain Kane's small band of defenders had held the bridge entrance through 4 separate waves of attack, each one costing the Skarn more warriors than the last, but each one also costing the humans dearly in return. Of the original crew members who had chosen to remain and fight, only Kane, Osei, Reyes, and Dr. Nair still stood at the bridge itself, though word had come through the ship's damaged intercom system that Diaz and his surviving Marine had managed to hold the maintenance corridor, barely, at the cost of the second Marine taking a serious wound that left her unable to continue fighting. Kane leaned against the edge of the barricade, his breathing labored, his vision occasionally swimming from blood loss despite Dr. Nair's repeated field treatments. He knew, with the clear-eyed honesty of a man who had faced death many times before in his long career, that his body was reaching its limits. But his mind remained sharp, focused entirely on the tactical problem in front of him, because a captain's most valuable weapon, especially when physical strength failed, was always his ability to think clearly under pressure. "Sir, new contact," Osei reported, her voice hoarse from hours of shouting orders and firing weapons. Second Skarn vessel has launched additional boarding pods. I'm counting at least 8 more incoming. Kane closed his eyes for a brief moment, doing the math. 8 more pods meant potentially another 60 to 80 Skarn warriors joining a fight his exhausted, wounded crew had barely survived against a much smaller force. The odds, already terrible, were about to become nearly impossible. Reyes, status on Fleet Command? Kane asked. Still 3 hours out, sir. Maybe a little less if they're pushing their engines hard, Reyes replied. I've kept them updated on our situation. Admiral Whitfield says she's diverting 2 additional cruisers to try and reach us faster, but even at maximum speed, it'll still be over 2 hours. 2 hours? Kane doubted honestly that his exhausted, depleted crew could hold against a fresh wave of 80 Skarn warriors for even 20 more minutes, let alone 2 hours. The math simply did not favor survival, not through direct confrontation alone. He needed something else, something clever. Something that could shift the balance of this fight in ways that raw numbers and firepower could not easily overcome. And as he stood there, forcing his exhausted mind to work through the problem, an idea began to take shape, born from 30 years of naval experience and an intimate knowledge of his own ship's capabilities that no Skarn commander, however skilled, could possibly match. "Osei," Kane said, his voice suddenly carrying renewed energy despite his physical exhaustion. "Pull up the schematics for the ship's remaining reactor core containment systems." Osei's fingers moved quickly across her console, and the requested schematic appeared on a nearby display. "What are you thinking, sir?" The Vigilance reactor took damage during the initial battle, but it's still stable, just barely. If we deliberately destabilize the containment field, in a controlled way, we can create a massive energy discharge that we can direct through the ship's damaged sections, using the exposed conduits we already identified. Not enough to destroy the ship outright, but enough to create a devastating pulse through any section where Skarn forces are concentrated. Osei's eyes widened as she understood the implications. "Sir, that's incredibly risky. If we misjudge the containment breach even slightly, we could trigger a full reactor cascade and destroy the ship entirely, along with everyone still aboard." "I know," Kane said grimly, "but if we don't do something dramatic, we're not surviving the next assault wave regardless. I'd rather take a calculated risk than simply wait to be overwhelmed." Osei studied the schematics for a long moment, her tactical mind working through the engineering challenge with the same fierce focus she had shown throughout the entire battle. "I think I can rig a controlled discharge, sir, but I'll need access to the auxiliary engineering station, not the bridge controls. The bridge doesn't have direct access to the containment field regulators." Kane's jaw tightened. The auxiliary engineering station was 2 decks away, in a section that had not yet seen direct Skarn assault, but reaching it would mean splitting their already thin defense even further. "I'll go," Osei said before Kane could even voice his concern. "You need to hold the bridge, sir. I'm the only one who can properly execute this modification anyway." "Take Reyes with you," Kane said after a moment's consideration. "Dr. Nair and I can hold here with the last of our defensive traps prepared. Go, now, before that second wave arrives." Osei nodded, grabbed a rifle from the weapons locker, and moved quickly toward the bridge's rear exit, Reyes following close behind her, his communications equipment left running on autopilot to maintain the fragile channel to Fleet Command. As they disappeared into the smoke-filled corridors, Kane turned back toward the barricade, where Dr. Nair had taken up a defensive position, rifle in hand, her medical kit set aside for the moment, in favor of a more immediately useful tool. "Just the 2 of us now, Captain," Nair said, forcing a tired, grim smile. "Just the 2 of us," Kane agreed. "How are you holding up, Doctor?" "Better than you, probably," Nair said, glancing pointedly at his blood-soaked shoulder. "You should be unconscious from blood loss by now, honestly. I don't know what's keeping you standing." Kane managed a weak smile of his own. "Stubbornness, mostly. And the fact that I've got people counting on me to keep this fight going a little longer." Nair's expression softened slightly, the professional concern of a doctor mixing with something like genuine respect and worry for a man she had served alongside for years. "Well, try not to let stubbornness kill you before the Skarn do, Captain. I'd rather patch you up properly once this is over." "Noted, Doctor." The renewed Skarn assault arrived faster than either of them expected. Vrek, having received word that his reinforcements were nearly in position aboard the Vigilant, pushed his remaining forces into a final, coordinated push toward the bridge, determined to end this increasingly costly battle before his commanders back at the Dominion fleet began questioning why a simple boarding action against a crippled ship had taken so many hours and cost so many warriors. Kane and Nair fought desperately against this new wave, using every trap and advantage the ship's damaged systems could offer, but the numbers were simply too great. A group of Skarn warriors managed to flank their position through a side corridor Kane had not had enough personnel to properly defend, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed the bridge itself might fall. "Captain, we're being flanked!" Nair shouted, firing desperately at the new threat while trying to maintain her position against the main assault as well. Kane spun, firing his own weapon at the flanking Skarn warriors, dropping one with a well-placed shot before a return volley of plasma fire forced him back behind cover, close enough that he felt the searing heat against his cheek. His body, already pushed far beyond reasonable limits, began to fail him in small but terrifying ways, his vision blurring, his hands trembling slightly around his weapon. Not now, he told himself fiercely. Not yet. Just a little longer. He forced himself back into the fight, drawing on reserves of willpower that seemed to come from somewhere beyond simple physical strength, some deeper source that 30 years of service and a lifetime of stubborn refusal to accept defeat had built within him. He fired again, and again, holding the line alongside Dr. Nair even as the situation grew more desperate with every passing second. 2 decks away, Osei and Reyes fought their own desperate battle to reach the auxiliary engineering station, encountering scattered Skarn forces along the way but managing, through a combination of luck, skill, and Osei's intimate knowledge of the ship's layout, to avoid the largest concentrations of enemy warriors. They reached the auxiliary station just as the sounds of intensified fighting echoed from the direction of the bridge, and Osei immediately set to work on the containment field modifications, her fingers flying across the console with practiced precision, despite the tension and fear clearly written across her exhausted features. "How long?" Reyes asked, standing guard at the station's entrance, rifle ready. "A few minutes, maybe less," Osei replied without looking up from her work. "This isn't exactly standard procedure. I'm essentially rewiring safety protocols that were specifically designed to prevent what I'm trying to do." "The captain's counting on us," Reyes said quietly. "I know," Osei said, her focus never wavering. "Believe me, I know." Back at the bridge, the situation had grown dire. Kane and Nair, though fighting with everything they had left, found themselves being slowly pushed back from the barricade as more Skarn warriors poured into the corridor, their numbers finally beginning to overwhelm the human defenders' ability to hold the line. Kane took a glancing hit to his uninjured arm, the pain sharp and immediate, but he gritted his teeth and continued fighting, refusing to let the wound slow him down more than absolutely necessary. "Captain, we can't hold much longer," Nair shouted, her own ammunition running dangerously low. "Just a little more," Kane said, though even he could hear the strain in his own voice, the growing uncertainty about whether a little more was actually possible, given how depleted their resources had become. At that moment, Vrek himself entered the fray, having grown impatient with his warriors' continued struggle against what should have been an easy final push. He moved through the smoke and chaos with the confident stride of a veteran warrior, his blades raised, his orange eyes fixed directly on Captain Kane, whom he had come to see, somewhat to his own surprise, as a worthy opponent, deserving of a personal confrontation, rather than simply being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. "Captain," Vrek called out, his translated voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. "You have fought with more honor than any human I have faced in this entire war. But this battle ends now. Face me directly, warrior to warrior, and I will ensure your death is remembered with the respect it deserves." Kane, exhausted and wounded but still standing, looked across the smoke-filled corridor at the imposing Skarn commander, and something in him, some deep well of stubborn defiance that had carried him through 30 years of service, and now through the hardest battle of his life, rose to meet the challenge. "All right," Kane said, straightening despite the pain screaming through his body, holstering his nearly depleted sidearm, and drawing instead a combat knife from his belt, a personal weapon he had carried since his earliest days in the fleet. "Let's finish this then, you and me." Nair's eyes widened in alarm. "Captain, You can barely stand. Cover me, Doctor, Kane said quietly, his eyes never leaving Vrek. This needs to happen. Vrek gestured for his remaining warriors to hold back, granting the human captain the personal duel he seemed to genuinely desire, a concept the Skarn valued highly, despite their otherwise brutal approach to warfare. Warrior honor demanded certain respects be paid to a worthy adversary, and Vrek had come, over the course of this exhausting battle, to genuinely believe Kane deserved such respect. The two combatants faced each other across the debris-strewn corridor, one a massive, four-armed alien warrior, wielding twin curved blades, with the ease of decades of practice. The other, a wounded, exhausted human captain, armed with nothing more than a simple combat knife, and an unbreakable will to keep fighting, regardless of the odds stacked against him. 2 decks away, unaware of the personal drama unfolding at the bridge, Osei finished her modifications to the reactor containment field with trembling hands, knowing that what she was about to do carried enormous risk, but also knowing it represented their best chance of turning this desperate battle in humanity's favor. "It's ready," she said to Reyes, her voice tight with tension. "I just need to trigger it remotely, once we know where the largest concentration of Skarn forces is located." "The bridge," Reyes said grimly, checking the tactical display on his portable communicator. "Nearly all remaining Skarn forces are converged there right now." Osei's face went pale with the terrible understanding of what that meant. Triggering the discharge now would strike directly at the location where Captain Kane himself was currently fighting for his life. "Osei," Reyes said quietly, understanding her hesitation immediately. "The captain gave us this mission, knowing exactly what it might mean. He's counting on us to make the hard call if it comes to that." Osei closed her eyes for a brief moment, her finger hovering over the trigger control, the weight of an impossible decision settling onto her shoulders in a way that no amount of tactical training could fully prepare a person to handle. Back at the bridge, Captain Marcus Kane raised his combat knife to meet Vrek Thozar's twin blades, and the final, decisive confrontation of this brutal, desperate battle began. Vrek Thozar moved first, his twin blades flashing through the smoke-filled air with the speed and precision of decades of combat experience. Kane barely managed to dodge the first strike, throwing himself sideways with a movement that sent fresh agony tearing through his wounded shoulder, and he felt, rather than saw, the second blade pass close enough to slice through the fabric of his uniform sleeve. This was not a fair fight, and both combatants knew it. Vrek stood taller, stronger, faster, with 4 arms to Kane's 2, and decades of dedicated combat training against a human captain who, despite his own considerable experience, was operating on a body pushed far beyond reasonable limits by blood loss, exhaustion, and the accumulated toll of hours of continuous fighting. But Kane had one advantage Vrek could not fully account for. He understood exactly what he was fighting for, and that understanding gave him a kind of focus that transcended simple physical capability. Kane rolled beneath a follow-up strike, coming up close against Vrek's body, where the Skarn commander's longer reach became less of an advantage, and drove his combat knife toward an exposed gap in Vrek's armor near the shoulder joint. The blade found its mark, drawing dark alien blood and a sharp grunt of pain from Vrek. Though the wound was far from fatal, Vrek retaliated with a vicious backhand strike from one of his lower arms, catching Kane across the jaw and sending him stumbling backward, blood now flowing freely from a fresh cut near his old scar. Kane's vision swam for a dangerous moment, the accumulated damage of the entire battle threatening to finally overwhelm him, but he forced himself to stay upright, to keep his knife raised, to keep fighting, even as every instinct in his exhausted body screamed at him to simply collapse. "You fight well, for a dying man," Vrek said, circling slowly, respect and something like genuine curiosity clear in his rumbling voice. "Why do you continue? You must know this fight is already lost." Kane spat blood onto the corridor floor and met Vrek's gaze directly, his own eyes burning with a fierce, unbreakable determination, despite everything his body had already endured. "Maybe, but a fight isn't really about winning or losing, not entirely. It's about what you're willing to give for the people counting on you. My crew is counting on me. My people back home are counting on this fleet to hold the line against your dominion. So I don't get to just lie down and quit, not while I've still got breath in my body." Vrek considered this for a moment, something shifting behind his glowing orange eyes, a flicker of genuine philosophical uncertainty that had not existed in him before this battle began. In Skarn culture, strength was measured by conquest, by the ability to impose your will upon others through superior force. But here was a human, wounded nearly to the point of death, still finding strength not from a desire to conquer, but from a desire to protect. It was a concept Vrek had encountered before in Skarn philosophy, buried in old texts about the earliest days of Skarn civilization, before conquest became their defining trait, but he had never expected to see it demonstrated so clearly by a member of a species his own culture had dismissed as fundamentally weak. "Perhaps," Vrek said slowly, "there is more strength in your kind than my commanders believed." "You're about to find out exactly how much," Kane said, and lunged forward with renewed determination. What followed was a desperate, brutal exchange, both combatants drawing on their remaining reserves of strength and skill in a fight that had become as much about will as about physical capability. Kane took another wound, a shallow cut along his ribs that stole his breath momentarily, but he managed to land 2 more solid strikes against Vrek in return, driving the alien commander back with a combination of desperate aggression and the kind of unpredictable, improvised fighting style that came from a human military tradition built on adaptability rather than rigid combat doctrine. Meanwhile, 2 decks away, Ose made her decision, her hand trembling, as she activated the modified containment discharge, directing it precisely toward the corridor sections, furthest from the bridge itself, where the largest concentration of reserve Skarn warriors waited, rather than the immediate area where Kane and Vrek fought their personal duel. It was a calculated risk, a narrower, less powerful discharge than originally planned, but one that spared the bridge corridor, while still striking a devastating blow against the majority of Vrek's remaining forces. The reactor discharge surged through the ship's damaged conduits with a brilliant flash of blue-white energy, and throughout the sections where Skarn reinforcements had gathered, warriors were thrown from their feet, their armor systems overloading from the sudden energy surge, several rendered unconscious or severely disoriented by the unexpected attack. It was not a killing blow for most of them, but it was devastating enough to shatter the coordinated assault Vrek had been counting on, to finally overwhelm the human defenders. At that same moment, a new voice crackled through the ship's damaged communication systems, Reyes's voice, carrying clear excitement despite the chaos. "Captain, fleet reinforcements just entered the system. Admiral Whitfield pushed her ships beyond safe operating limits to reach us faster. They're engaging the Skarn fleet now." Through the Vigilant's remaining external sensors, still functioning despite everything the ship had endured, new contacts appeared on the tactical display. Human warships emerging from their jump points and immediately opening fire on the Skarn vessels that had been besieging the crippled flagship. The Dread Talon, the reinforcement cruiser that had been preparing to send even more boarding parties toward the Vigilant, found itself suddenly forced to divert its attention toward this new threat, unable to spare additional forces for the boarding action that had already cost the Skarn Dominion far more than anyone had anticipated. Vrek, receiving this news through his own suit's communication system, even as he continued his duel with Kane, felt the tactical situation shift decisively against him. His reinforcements would not be coming. His forces aboard the Vigilant, already decimated by hours of stubborn human resistance, had just suffered another devastating blow from the reactor discharge, and now human warships were arriving to challenge the fleet that had been providing cover for this entire boarding operation. "It seems your reinforcements have arrived," Vrek said, breathing heavily, blood flowing from multiple wounds inflicted during his duel with Kane. "A fortunate turn of events for you, human." "Wasn't luck," Kane said, equally exhausted, barely able to stand but refusing to show it. "Was my crew doing exactly what I trained them to do? Hold the line, buy time, trust that help would come. That's not luck. That's discipline. That's the difference between a crew that fights because they're ordered to, and a crew that fights because they believe in each other." Vrek lowered his blade slightly, studying the wounded human captain with an expression that, for the first time in the entire battle, held something approaching genuine respect, rather than simple curiosity or grudging acknowledgement. "I have fought many species across many campaigns, Captain. I have seen warriors driven by hatred, warriors driven by fear, warriors driven by simple duty. I do not think I have encountered warriors driven by what your crew demonstrated today. This..." This loyalty, this refusal to abandon each other even when logic suggested surrender or retreat as the wiser course. That's what makes us dangerous, Kane said quietly. Not our weapons, not our ships. It's that we don't leave each other behind, not while there's still a chance to keep fighting for one another. For a long moment, the two commanders simply stood facing each other in the smoke-filled, blood-stained corridor, the sounds of a battle now clearly shifting in humanity's favor, echoing distantly through the ship's damaged systems. Vrek seemed to be weighing something internally, some calculation that went beyond simple military tactics. "My warriors who remain will withdraw," Vrek finally said. "This engagement no longer serves the Dominion's interests, and I will not spend more lives on a prize that has already cost far more than it could ever be worth. But know this, Captain Kane, you have earned a reputation this day that will follow you throughout Skarn territory. They will speak of the human captain who could not be broken, who bled but did not fall, who turned a boarding action into a battle the Dominion will remember for generations." Kane, swaying slightly on his feet from exhaustion and blood loss, managed a tired but genuine smile. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It was intended as one," Vrek said, and then, with a final glance at the human captain who had defied every expectation the Skarn Dominion held about humanity's weakness, he signaled to his remaining warriors and began an organized withdrawal back toward the boarding pods, still capable of returning to the retreating Skarn vessels. Kane watched them go, his knife still gripped in a trembling hand, and only once the last Skarn warrior had disappeared back into the smoke did he finally allow his body to give way to the exhaustion it had been fighting for hours. He collapsed to his knees, and Dr. Nair rushed to his side immediately, catching him before he could fall completely. "Captain, stay with me, Captain," Nair said urgently, pressing fresh bandages against his multiple wounds, even as she checked his vital signs with practiced efficiency. "Still here, Doctor," Kane managed, his voice weak but steady. "Just resting my eyes for a moment." "You are not allowed to die on me now, Marcus Kane," Nair said fiercely, using his first name for perhaps the first time in years of professional service together. "Not after everything you just survived. Do you understand me?" Kane managed a weak chuckle despite the pain. "Wouldn't dream of it, Doctor. Told you, I don't go down easy." Osei and Reyes arrived moments later, having made their way back from the auxiliary engineering station, and found their captain being tended to by Dr. Nair amid the wreckage of the corridor where the final duel had taken place. The relief on their faces was palpable as they saw him still breathing, still conscious, despite everything. "Sir, the Skarn are in full retreat," Osei reported, kneeling beside Kane. "Fleet reinforcements have engaged their main force. Preliminary reports suggest we're actually winning this engagement now." "Good," Kane murmured, his eyes beginning to close despite his best efforts to stay alert. "Tell the Admiral. Tell her the Vigilant held. Tell her my crew held." "You can tell her yourself, sir," Reyes said gently. "You're going to make it." What followed, in the hours and days after that brutal battle, became something of a legend throughout the human fleet and, eventually, throughout Skarn Dominion territory as well. Captain Marcus Kane survived his wounds, though it took months of recovery and 2 additional surgeries to fully repair the damage his body had endured during those desperate hours defending the Vigilant. The ship itself, though heavily damaged, was successfully towed back to friendly territory for repairs, becoming something of a symbol throughout the fleet, the ship that had refused to fall, even when boarded, crippled and outnumbered. The story of Kane's stand spread quickly through military channels, then through civilian news networks, then eventually, through channels the Skarn Dominion itself could not fully control, into whispered legends among Skarn warriors, who spoke with grudging respect about the human captain, who had turned certain defeat into a battle worthy of genuine honor. Vrek Thozar, upon returning to Dominion territory, reported honestly about the battle's outcome to his own commanders, an act of integrity that cost him some standing among Skarn leadership who preferred simpler narratives about easy conquest, but earned him quiet respect among warriors who valued honest accounts of genuine courage, regardless of which side displayed it. For humanity, the Battle of the Vigilant, as it came to be known, represented something more than just a tactical victory in an ongoing war. It became a symbol of a deeper truth about human resilience, the understanding that strength was not always measured in raw power or overwhelming numbers, but sometimes in the simple, stubborn refusal to accept defeat, in the willingness to keep fighting not for glory or conquest, but for the people who depended on you. Captain Marcus Kane, once recovered, returned to active duty, eventually receiving a promotion to admiral and taking command of a larger portion of the human fleet. But he never forgot the lessons of that desperate battle aboard his crippled flagship, and he carried those lessons forward into every subsequent engagement of the long war against the Skarn Dominion. That courage mattered more than fear, that loyalty between comrades could overcome even the most impossible odds, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon a person could wield was simply the unbreakable will to refuse to die, not for their own sake, but for everyone counting on them to keep fighting. The war between humanity and the Skarn Dominion would continue for years after that battle, filled with victories and losses on both sides, filled with sacrifice and courage and tragedy in equal measure. But throughout the rest of that long conflict, whenever human forces found themselves facing overwhelming odds, whenever hope seemed impossibly distant, soldiers and officers alike would remember the story of the vigilant, and they would draw strength from the knowledge that their captain, wounded and outnumbered, and given every reasonable excuse to surrender, had chosen instead to stand, and to fight, and to refuse to die. And in some small way, every human who fought after that day carried a piece of that same stubborn, unbreakable spirit forward with them, a spirit that the Skarn Dominion, for all their strength and all their conquests, would come to understand they could never truly defeat. Because some things, humanity had proven that day, were simply not meant to be broken.